All right, I see a few more people coming in. I think it's time to get started. Good morning, everyone. I hope you had a great time at the keynote. I'm going to give this just a few seconds on the screen. You do get some points for recording which breakout sessions and which activities you've done. So snap that, and then please give me feedback at the end. I want to start this talk, though, with you, the audience. This is Build. It's a convention for our developers, by developers. And our apps are really our babies. We pour our hearts into them, hour after hour, day after day, so that when we finally release them into the world, they find a good place. But for them to be ready for the workplace, we need to make those apps responsible, trustworthy members of the app community, so that they can find a place in the workplace. That's how we get rewarded, by getting them chosen by customers. And who is doing this choosing? If you've chosen to come to this talk, it's because you care about the enterprise customer. And I think there's an archetype that comes immediately to mind. It's the IT administrator. I think that this is a very misunderstood character. So I'm going to compare the IT administrator to another misunderstood character. Bear with me. If you haven't seen Willy Wonka, if you haven't read Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, you won't miss anything here. But if you have, the parallels are quite striking. Consider that the people he serves really don't understand what he does or how he does it. They may ascribe near magical powers to him. But the most important thing is that they don't understand why. And so they think he's a little off-center. Actually, some of them think he might be crazy, because he wants absolutely everything to be locked down in his domain. Nothing is ever, ever supposed to leave his domain. It's okay to come in. You can never go out now. And he has all of these policies and procedures and mechanisms to keep that from happening. But the reality is, he knows it's leaving. Everyone else knows it's leaving. And so he just loses his stuff about this. Is he a control freak? Is he crazy? I submit to you that if he's crazy, it's because his users make him crazy. Really. Do you realize 87% of senior managers, so we mean VP and up, 87% are sending work to personal email or personal cloud. 58% admit that they have sent a sensitive document to someone they did not intend to. Both of those numbers are the numbers that they admit. It may be higher than that. You may remember from about a month ago, there was something in the news about the G20 summit and how all of the G20 leaders' sensitive personal data, their itineraries, their passports, had gone to someone in the Asia Cup. So this is a very real problem. By the way, do you know how they solved that problem? Autocomplete. They turned off autocomplete. What? Are they crazy? So we need to help this guy. We have to show him a better world, a more enlightened world. We have to restore his faith in AppKind. And it doesn't take that much. We just need to respect the stewardship of data that we might be given in our app. Don't reveal company secrets. And respect the terms of use of that data. So that's one kind of enterprise customer. But there's another enterprise customer. Can you guess whose character this is? No, I'm messing with you. It's just people. People like you and me. And what do we want? We want our work stuff available on our personal devices. And we want as little management as possible. We know that there needs to be some management, but as little as possible. And we should all realize that we're human. We make mistakes. So any information protection strategy needs to take the human factor into account. So what is Windows 10 doing? Well, we've been on an information protection journey in Windows for a while now. It started with device protection. When a device is lost or stolen, we can protect that with full volume encryption. We've made a lot of enhancements in BitLocker over the last years. A lot of the feedback was around deployment and provisioning. Well, deploying the software is about as easy as it can be. It comes with the operating system. But provisioning can be very time-consuming. So in Windows 8, we introduced use space only. And so you can provision with the device and the image at the same time with BitLocker. And I think we've actually got the best provisioning solution possible on an Instant Go device. You take it out of the box, you run through the out-of-box experience, and it's protected. It's to the point where third-party vendors for full-volume encryption actually use BitLocker, or they have businesses around managing BitLocker. So that's the bottom of the stack. That's when the whole device is lost. The user isn't even present, but we've prevented an accidental leak. Then there's the situation where the user is involved. They're sharing data. And they want to apply policy to protect it and encrypt it. And for this, we have rights management. You may be more familiar with this as information protection or information rights management as it was integrated into Office. And if you've ever used this feature where you prevent reply all, or you own the conversation and no one else can reply, you've used rights management. This is a great solution for controlling access when you're being thoughtful about it. The main feedback about this was, again, about deployment. Deploying RMS on-prem can be very expensive. It also doesn't work business to business and business to consumer. So we took this feedback, and a couple years ago, we provided Azure Rights Management. Combined with Azure Active Directory, there's a cloud account now that can share data across businesses. And the deployment is fairly simple. It's a little bit more configuration than a DirSync. So that's great. But what happens when most of the time the user is in charge of the data, but is not thinking deeply about their sharing? And that's where we have a gap. That's when accidental leak occurs. And for that, we need enterprise data protection. When we were thinking about how to solve this problem, we looked around at what other people were doing, and there are a few pain points. First, most of these on mobile devices require being in a different mode. You have to jump into a little container. That's where your enterprise apps and your enterprise data need to live. So you take your work self and put it in, and you take your personal self and take it out, and you put your work self in. It's like a game, but it's not very natural. Maybe a quick show of hands. How many people have checked Facebook or posted to Twitter during work hours? The camera's on me, so you can be honest. Yeah, like at least half of you, and those are the ones that admit it. So that's the way normal people act. We're a more integrated person. So if that's not jarring enough, users also have to use different apps. In the app container, that's where your secure mail is, and out there is where the mail app you really want to use is, and the secure browser versus the browser you'd really like to use. And then the experience across devices is also different. From a phone to a tablet to your desktop, all of these are different. And for each of these, you usually have some kind of bolt-on solution. And that usually costs. In general, when the user experience is better, the dollar cost is higher too. This is not our vision. Our vision is that data protection is built into the operating system. Corporate data should be protected from inadvertent leak to users and public entities through all of these mechanisms that we've talked about, like email, social media, the cloud. And so we introduce enterprise data protection. Now, this is not the final marketing name. I was told very clearly I can't say that this is a marketing name. That will come later. But as a code name, it's very descriptive. We protect data at rest, and when it roams, if it roams, it's built into the operating system. So there's no need for mode switching. The user doesn't have to feel like they've entered crazy town just because their device is managed. Corporate data is kept separate and identifiable from personal data because we protect the corporate data, and it's encrypted and tagged to the enterprise that owns it. And the IT pro has control over that data because they also control the keys. They can revoke access by deleting the keys remotely, giving a selective wipe. This gives confidence to the user that their personal things are left alone, and the organization feels comfortable that they can control their data. We also provide a common experience across Windows Phone and tablet and desktop because it's a universal Windows platform. We also provide cross-platform support. So there are readers and editors for those other platforms that data are likely to go to. Because we're Windows and because we're Microsoft, we didn't leave it there. We care about security. And so we added some extra security with a feature called Data Protection Under Lock. This is an optional policy. I say optional, but in fact, a lot of your very security-conscious customers are going to turn this on, and you will need to know how it works. What it does is, when the screen is locked, when the user is not present, we throw away the decryption key. No access for enterprise data at all. So we block read, but here's the beautiful thing. We don't block write. Because we're using asymmetric cryptography, the encryption key is still present. And so you can receive emails. You can receive files synchronized from your enterprise. And the only way that you get access to this data is if you have the user credentials. We've done a great deal to harden credentials and make them easier. I actually encourage you to go see this talk this afternoon about Microsoft Passport and Windows Hello, how we tie the credential to hardware to make it extremely hard for someone to break in. But even without going to that talk, you should know that there's a Windows 8 feature that allows you to set policy along with device encryption so that if you enter your credentials wrong over and over a certain number of times, you get put into BitLocker recovery. This makes it very hard for an attacker. But if you own the device, you get your data back. All of this together helps mitigate system-level attacks. Because even we don't have the key, an attacker, even with a 0-day in a kernel mode driver, can't get it out of us because we don't know it. This is already shipped in GDR2 on phone. It only works on GDR2 with email, but with Windows 10, it will be expanded so that other applications can use it as well, including yours. Now, because this is a developer conference, you probably care about the app landscape. What does it look like? In an enterprise data protection world, there are really three kinds of application. There's the enterprise-only application. I like to think of these as the Oompa Loompas. They don't care about leaving the domain. They're perfectly happy in the domain. They wouldn't know a personal life if it bit them on the leg. These are the kinds of applications like line of business apps, your HR application, your back-end business connection that you have built in your IT department. These apps probably don't even need to be enlightened for EDP because everything that they do is going to be protected automatically if they're put onto the allowed list. More about that later. And then there are the personal applications. These might be games. These might be your social media applications. These might be the weather app. But they have no business handling business data. They don't need to be enlightened either, because they're never going to be handling enterprise data. But if you're still here, still listening to me, then you care about handling both of these at the same time. You want to address the entire consumer market, satisfy them, and also address the needs of the lucrative enterprise customer. By doing so, by enlightening your application, that is, using our SDK to understand the difference between work and personal, and keeping those lines separate, you get to provide a single experience to your users. You keep the data isolated and encrypted, of course, and by cooperating with the system, we can block or audit the exchange of data between these two parts of your life. The organization holds the keys so they can control access to it. And when I talk about this as being part of the app landscape, you better believe Microsoft is going to participate. We're going to enlighten the Office applications, OneDrive for Business, etc. We want to set the bar for a terrific experience that addresses the whole individual. We're providing APIs to you so that you can provide a delightful experience to your customers as well, so that your apps can be MDM managed. What does it look like to have a life cycle that's MDM managed on phone and tablet and desktop? It really starts with the worker deciding that they want their device to access corporate things. And so they sign up with the company. And they're provisioned with policy. There are really three kinds of policy that matter to enterprise data protection. There's the list of applications that the enterprise trusts to handle enterprise data. I just call this the allowed list. These are the things that are allowed to access enterprise resources, like files that have been protected, or network endpoints inside the enterprise, whether they can get VPN at all. So that comes to the second set of policies, network-related policies. Like I said, VPN. Now, the interesting thing is we actually do separate this out. So an application that's on the allowed list gets access to the VPN, and personal applications do not. We also describe the actual network boundary that the enterprise claims, so IP addresses and domain names, so that we know when you're contacting the enterprise and when that data will need to be protected. And the third is the application restriction policies themselves. So this is what defines the activity that occurs, if there's any activity that occurs, when you're attempting to cross the boundary. Do we audit and let it go? Do we ask the user for consent, or we just throw up a wall and say no? Now, once we have policy, data can now come in from the enterprise. And on data ingress, apps that are tuned into the enterprise channel need to protect that data. An example of this would be any sync engine that talks to the enterprise, like OneDrive for Business. And of course, email. This is probably the largest way that enterprise data enters a personal device. Once you've got data, it needs to go somewhere. You're going to persist it somewhere. There are a number of ways that we can protect data when it leaves the app and gets persisted to disk. The first is if you have a synchronization folder that's been protected, say by OneDrive for Business or work folders or your sync app, for example, then it's automatically encrypted when it enters that folder. The user also has an option when they're creating content in your app to decide that this is work data. Honest users are honest, and they will do so. They can choose in the save experience to do so, or even from the Explorer. And IT can configure unenlightened applications. And unenlightened applications have all of their data protected to the enterprise automatically for the duration of policy. And of course, your enlightened applications will understand the difference between work and personal and protect the enterprise data. Data can also leave an application not just to disk, but between applications. An enterprise enlightened application can ensure that this protection persists. Through application restriction policies, you can prevent access or at least audit when that happens, depending on policy. Whether it goes to that other app or not is up to the organization. And then for network policy, because you know when you're talking to the enterprise, you can prevent data from leaking outside the enterprise. Now, believe it or not, you should have had this takeaway from the keynote. We know that we're not the only member of the ecosystem. And so data may roam to other devices. And so we provide readers and editors on those other platforms. We also have a public SDK for handling secure sharing. I should also mention that Microsoft also has a mobile device management solution. It's called Intune. And we worked closely with the SDK owners in Intune to ensure that we have a common experience across these. The metaphors around identity switching are common across iOS, Android, and Windows because we work together closely. So this is how you can enable your iOS and Android apps for management with Intune using their SDK. For IT administrators, if you haven't enlightened your application, they can still get your application wrapped, kind of more old school style. It's not as optimal an experience, but it can be done. The main takeaway here is that Microsoft does have an MDM solution that covers iOS, Android, and Windows on all of its incarnations. Of course, the last step in the life cycle of enterprise data is when it gets revoked. I always smile about this because so many times when this is pitched to IT, it's, oh, the case where that guy got fired. It doesn't have to be an unhappy event. It didn't have to be that you lost your device in a cab. Far more likely, you just decided that you didn't want to use that device for work anymore. You're going to give it to a family member or sell it to pay for the new device that you're going to get, or you found a new opportunity. Whether it was you or the IT administrator that decided that you needed to unenroll, the keys get deleted on unenroll. And then the MDM agent in Windows looks for data that's no longer accessible to you and wipes it away clean to give that space back to you. I think it's enough time for a little more walk and a little less talk. So I'm going to switch to a demo here. I have here my OneDrive for Business. And I've put a couple of files in here. I've got a secret formula. I'm going to download that. I'm going to put it into my downloads directory here. And you can see that it's protected. It's protected to my company, because that's who's managing this device right now. I'll bring down another file here. It looks like I took a snapshot of the whiteboard the other day so that I could make some meeting notes when I was ready. I guess I'll do that after this talk. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't normally work in the downloads directory. So I'm going to bring that to Documents. Now, you'll see the protection persisted. I didn't need a container to ensure that my enterprise data was protected. In fact, I could have put it on a USB stick. I've got this very old USB stick. I'm not even sure. I might have got it from my daughter. It often says that it doesn't work. I'm going to test my demo Karma here. Oh, there's a problem with this drive. It's pretty bad. But let me bring up this. And I've got some personal stuff. If I take that document and bring it to this drive, what happens? I could take a copy of it, move it here. Protection was persisted. I didn't have to, for example, turn on BitLocker. I didn't need to think about that. Protection was just persisted automatically. So we also talked about how only certain applications get access. In my case, my organization has said that the Office applications are allowed applications. But WordPad is not on my list. So what happens if I try to open it with WordPad? I get access denied. Now, it's not that I am getting access denied, WordPad is. If I just go to open my secret formula, opens just fine. And it's not that I'm not allowed to access WordPad. I could open this personal file. It's a cookie recipe. That opens just fine, too. But there is still this boundary between work and personal. If I try to take this super secret formula and put it into mom's cookie recipe, hold on. My organization is saying this content is managed by me, and you're going to take it out of that context. You need to take responsibility for that action. It will be noted. So I agree, I probably shouldn't put this secret formula into my mom's recipe. Probably she wouldn't want the perspiration as an ingredient anyway. So that there's a little friction when you're crossing a boundary. But what if I'm just working? Say I've got this work folders here, and I have a business plan that I've started. Now, it's really just the start of a business plan. It's more of an idea of an idea. But what if I take some secret sauce? Can I copy that and bring that into this work document? Sure can. Friction-free, because it should be. You didn't cross a boundary. OK. I think I had another document I was looking for. Yes, I had these meeting notes. I took a snapshot. That's right. There was this strategy session, and there's this funny button, and I wonder what it does. Whoa. I almost accidentally posted this strategy session to my Twitter feed. All 12 people would have seen this. Well, OK, they could have retweeted it, and some of them are actually popular people. So I'm not going to do that. I was saved from a very costly mistake. It could have cost me my job. So this serves everyone. All right, so I should talk a little bit about unenlightened applications. You see, I've got this line of business application. It's an internal app. We use it for threat modeling, and I don't use it for fun, honest. But for the sake of argument, I don't use it for fun. And I'm going to create new content with this. And you'll see, the first time I've run this, it tells me that my files are going to be encrypted for my organization. I'll lose them when the device is disconnected from the workplace. That was good to know. Well, let me create a model, and I'll create a process and a thread, and I'll probably, I'm going to come back to this later. So I'm going to save this off. And you'll see that even though the application wasn't enlightened, the experience that they call into, the save as experience, the common file dialog, tells me that it's going to be protected to my enterprise. And indeed, if I save, and I go back to my documents, I see that this new threat model was protected. I also had a work folders, if I recall correctly. Yes, and you can see that it's protected as well. There's this metaphor of EFS-protected files being green. We're going to add some other icon or hint. I'll leave that to wiser minds that are better painters than me. But anything put into this folder is going to be protected. If I take my personal notes and put them here, they get protected automatically. And protection persists. So if I bring it back, it's still protected. But this is mine, and I know it's mine. So I'm going to take control of it again. Now, when I click this gets audited. And I'll show you that in a moment. But I feel comfortable letting my IT pro know, I took control of my own stuff. That's mine. So that's a bit of a feel for what it looks like. And this, let me find it. This is what the event viewer looks like. These event logs get uploaded through MDM. And you can see that I did take control of my personal notes. And I'm fine letting them know. So that's a bit of a taste of what it'll look like. Some rough edges, but we'll get there. So enough about unenlightened applications. We need to enlighten your application. An enlightened application recognizes enterprise data and protects it at rest, when it's in use, and in flight. And as a result, it abides by policy. Now notice what you're getting for free. You also recognize personal data. Anything that isn't enterprise is yours, and you don't need to apply policy to it. This is finally something that the organization and the individual can agree on. This is a real delighter. I think that this is going to be a competitive advantage for you. So the first thing that enlightened apps need to do, I should have promised, I'm going to show you code, is if you know you're enlightened, you say so. In your AppX manifest, declare the enterprise data policy capability. This is how we know prior to runtime that you're an enlightened application and can handle it. For example, your app is not running when a share contract is invoked, so we need to know then. You'll also noted that this is a restricted capability. So if you want to publish your app in the store, you'll need to be sponsored by someone at Microsoft. Many of you may already have an ISV ecosystem contact. If you don't, you can raise a support issue through the Dev Center to get this. If you have a Win32 application, then you need to update your resources script. And you do this with the Microsoft EDP Enlightened App Info. Add the EDP Enlightened App Info OID, set it to 1. Do this in the general section. Don't hide it inside a ifdef. The main takeaway here is we are supporting the classic Windows platform for enterprise data protection. All right, so let's get to enlightening your application. I actually think we need to have a little structure to this because there are several use cases. As we go through this, think about which one of these ones apply to you. For example, you might have an application that's mainly local. If your application only lets data leave through the inbox save experiences, you may only have 4 or 5 things to do. If your app is network capable and that's mostly what it does, say you're a sync application, not a lot of UI, again, you may only have a handful of things to do. I'm going to go through several use cases, though, because I don't know who I'm talking to, and I'm sure some of you do one, the other, or both. What are those use cases? We've already gone through them. There's when data comes in, data ingress. When data is in use, when data leaves, and events in the life cycle of enterprise data. Let me start with the local case. Check whether the data that you're looking at has the enterprise tag. If it does, then tell us. This way, the operating system can help enforce policy. Then when your data is leaving, persisted or going somewhere else, protect it. And when data is revoked, recognize the event, close down your enterprise data, and do any cleanup that's specific to your application. There's also 2 other events that happen. When data protection under lock is set, you need to know when the screen is locking and when the screen is unlocked. Because you need to know that you're going to be closing content and reopening content. On the network side of things, you need to check whether that endpoint that you're getting data from belongs to the enterprise. Partly that's because you're going to have to actually set up the VPN in a minute, if it is. That's not the only place that you can get enterprise data, though. If the IT administrator has decided that roaming and sharing is OK, you may get a containerized file. This would be sent over an untrusted network. And you need to unwrap that container and load it into the encrypting file system so that it can be used natively. Once you know that you're going to be talking to an enterprise network endpoint, you need to request VPN. That's because we have a secure by default policy. We don't give you access to something if you don't need it. If you're on the allowed list, this call will succeed. Then, when you're sending data off device, if it's an enterprise endpoint, fine, you can let it go. If it's not, well, if the IT pro hasn't allowed roaming and sharing, you just have to block. There are no other choices. If he's allowed roaming and sharing, you can decide to wrap that data for transport over an untrusted network. The events on the network side of things are the same kinds of events, but how you handle them need to be different. If you have a sync relationship with an enterprise endpoint, you're a file sync, you need to recognize revoke and break the relationship with the enterprise. This is extremely important because, well, let's take a nightmare scenario. You're not listening to revoke, but you are listening to changes in a folder. When the OS comes to clean up that data and wipes it, if you take that delete, pass it to the server, it's going to pass it on to other endpoints, and now you've lost data when all you really wanted to do was retire that device. Then for screen lock and unlock, there are some different cases that you'll have as well. When the screen locks, you won't be able to upload anymore because you won't be able to read the files. You will still be able to download. And then when the screen is back up, you can resume your uploads. OK, let's take it one by one. Let's start with checking the tag on the data that's coming in. There are 3 new classes in this namespace, Windows Security Enterprise Data. The first one we'll talk about is File Protection Manager. I'll skip around because we're going to be doing this by use case. This lets you take an iStorage item and determine whether it's protected, how it's protected, and to whom it's protected. So here's a little snapshot of code. I'll give you a second to look at it. It's very straightforward. We're just checking for the status on the file. That means it's enterprise. That means it's managed, right? Close. This is a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient to know that it's managed. And so I come to the second class. The Protection Policy Manager has a set of APIs in it for understanding and setting policy. This tells you whether an identity string is being managed at the current time. And an identity is either an email address or a domain that belongs to the enterprise. Data is only managed when the identity protecting it is also managed. So we go back to our previous snippet of code, and we add a check. Is identity managed? OK. Then we need to do something about that. We'll have to set our enterprise mode, protect data, et cetera. You can get other stati from this. It could be that you have data that's not protected. That's going to happen a lot, too. All of that is personal data. You may also see revoked. It's possible that you'll see that status on data. It could be that the agent hasn't come along and deleted that file yet. You might want to execute your revocation code then, too. Now, when data can come in, it could come from a share contract or from a clipboard or drag-drop operation. And so we updated the data transfer APIs as well. We've added this enterprise ID so that you can check whether this belongs to the enterprise. The managed clipboard and share gets tagged. If it's not managed, if this is a personal clipboard item, then it's an empty string. You'll see a theme here. So very straightforward. It's a new property under the data properties, enterprise ID. Handle it as personal if it's empty. Otherwise, treat it as work. OK, so data coming in to a local app. What about over the network? We need to check if the host belongs to the enterprise. For that, we get this mouthful. Get primary managed identity for network endpoint, async. You can guess what it does now. It takes a host name and then returns an enterprise identity. An empty string means it's personal. Here you'll see I get the host from this URI object. I check to see if it's null or empty. If it's not, I know that I'm going to have to ask for VPN and protect the data that's coming down. Oh, that's right. We need to unwrap files. This is one of those things that you might decide is optional in your application. That's fine. But if you do, then you need to load it in. And you use load file from container async. This is, again, on the File Protection Manager class. It takes a containerized file and makes a new file. I have grayed out most of this because it's just setup. But the main thing to take away is that we are creating a new file. The original container stays there. You may need it because you might be comparing it for changes up on the server, for example. Now, you've got this data in your application now. You need to tell us that you're handling that data. This is how we know to tag your outgoing data. This puts your app view into managed mode, and it affects clipboard and share operations. So you can think of this as you're getting an instance of the Protection Policy Manager for your view, and then telling us which identity for which it needs to be managed. This is actually a really handy function. You could probably just take it wholesale into your application. Again, you'll see that when the identity is an empty string, it's personal, and we set it to personal using the same method. Now, you need to turn on the VPN when you need it. How do you do that? Well, you use create current thread network context. You actually give this thread a context so that the sockets created on it use the enterprise VPN. A little bit of setup, so I'll give you a second to look at it. I'm creating an HTTP client. When I do new, that's when the socket is getting created. And you can see that I've set a context before I create the socket, and immediately afterwards I dispose of it. Just basic bracketing. I've already set up the socket, though. It already has the VPN. It doesn't lose it. It persists onwards. But because I've set the context back to personal, future connections don't get the VPN unless I do this again. Now, protecting data locally. This is something that everyone is going to have to do. And so we've made this as simple as possible. File Protection Manager, protect async, takes an iStorage item and an enterprise ID string, and then encrypts it to a key that's related to that identity. I didn't even put the standard best practices stuff here about checking your return result, because I want to emphasize there are no special APIs needed to handle protected data. You just use your regular stuff. There's very little to do to be able to protect data and work on it. Data also comes in other formats. It doesn't always encompass an entire file. You might have a database that has a mix of content. I can certainly imagine an email client, for example, getting work mail and personal mail. But you need to keep them separate. And so you can encrypt the work stuff and leave the personal stuff alone. This API takes an iBuffer and an enterprise ID and gives you a brand new iBuffer. The reason we do this is because we're handling the key management for you. So we can allocate the space, and we can possibly even change the implementation in the future if necessary. I finally get around to checking my return result. So WinRT does not throw. At least most of the time it's not throwing. It's designed not to. And so you need to check your return parameters. Here's an example of where I do, because it might be that I attempt to protect and it didn't actually happen. And you need to know that. I also talked earlier about how we're enlightening the in-box save experiences. So if you're familiar with setting a suggested file, if that suggested file is already protected, then the context of the save experience will default to protecting the target. The user can change it, but the default is already set, so they don't have to think about it. In addition, you may not have a suggested file yet. You might just have an empty file or a new file, but you already know that you're handling enterprise data. It could be that you've received something in a share. and now you know that this is enterprise data. So we use this API, really a property, to let you set the identity string. This sets the dropdown to set the default. And again, if the user changes this default to set it personal, it will be audited. This is a very simple sample, so I won't belabor it too much. The main thing I want you to take away, though, is the user still does have a choice. They could have decided, this data is really mine, even though you set the default to enterprise. So you do need to check, did that file get protected? OK, we're in the home stretch now. The revoke events, in fact, all of the events, are handled the same way in code. What you do in them may be different, but how you set up those handlers are exactly the same. Within the Protection Policy Manager class, we have this event, protected content revoked. Just set up a handler for it, and then do what you need to do. I actually advise that it'd be good to have a common routine, because you could notice this on startup, or you may get it as an event. Clean up files, remove credentials, that sort of thing. And again, I'm going to hit this hard. If you are an enterprise sync engine, that's when you break the enterprise sync relationship. The events for screen lock and unlock are called protected access suspending and protected access resumed. You do need to, well, I strongly advise you register for both so that you know when those two things are happening. So remember, you might not be able to read that content, but you will be able to write new content. So if you're creating a new mail application, or you need to do some playback, you can still do that. And then when you close it, it won't be accessible. The other thing is, the kinds of companies that want this policy are deeply concerned about how much exposure they have. So close as much enterprise content as possible when you get these events that say, I'm locking now. This is going to be a differentiator for you. They will be measuring based off of how much exposure you're giving. I won't belabor it. You'll get these slides afterwards, so you'll be able to see what the shape of these are. It looks very much like the revoked event. So far, I've talked completely about user data. And I've talked completely about enterprise data protection. There's another feature that I want to highlight for you, because we've updated it for the enterprise and for the user. This is OS settings and app data roaming. This is that thing that gives the magical experience of having left off on your phone or your tablet and coming back to it on your desktop, or vice versa, and just picking up where you left off. We didn't have this experience for the enterprise before, mainly because we were using Microsoft accounts, Hotmail, Live, those sorts of things, when you're logging into Windows, to know where to send that data. So in Windows 10, we've extended this to our other cloud identity, Azure Active Directory. We provide feature parity with Windows 8 and 8.1 settings and app data roaming, but with additional security and management capabilities that are tailored to those people who really need to control their data. And there are some premium administrative features that are available through the Enterprise Mobility Suite. This includes things like RMS and mobile device management with Intune. Data is automatically protected to the identity that's associated with that. So if you signed into Windows with your Microsoft account, those settings roam through your Microsoft account through OneDrive. If you signed into Windows using those work or school accounts in Azure Active Directory, those OS settings travel through the tenant that owns that identity. And if you've got an application that you've acquired, if you acquired it with your personal identity, those settings roam through OneDrive. And if you got it through your work or school account, it'll roam through the tenant. These things are available on Windows Phone and desktop. Now, I kind of blew past this thing about the new cloud identity, so I encourage you, it's at least a third of a session. So go and see session 709. I think it's this afternoon, where we talk about single sign-on. The setup for it tells you more about how we're doing this cloud identity stuff. So I talked about security and manageability. What did I mean? Well, for security, all the data in transit is protected with TLS. And then when it's at rest in the cloud, it's protected with RMS. Now, your organization gets key management for free if they want. They just let Microsoft manage it. If the organization wants a little more control, and many of them do, they can buy a premium experience where the keys are managed in a hardware security module in the cloud, and they can revoke access to that HSM when they decide. On the management side of things, the base protection is you can turn it on or off. Do you want roaming in your enterprise? No? Yes? If you want more granular control, like you want to say this group over here can have roaming settings and that one over there can't, you can get that with a premium payment. And then you can get the finest granularity of possible with the MDM solution. The admins can turn it on per device or turn it off per device. This being an existing feature, there are already a ton of resources available. You can see that there are existing APIs. There's a blog. There's quick start guides. There's just a ton of stuff. So I encourage you, after this, get the deck. You can click through those resources. There's also a ton on our MDM solution. I hope that some of you got a chance to see the talk yesterday about mobile device management. But if you didn't, these talks are all recorded. You can go back and check them out. There's also these resources here. You can check the MDM documentation. And next week at Ignite, which is another conference that's focused mainly on the IT professional and decision maker, there are another series of talks. They will also be recorded. And you can get much more drill-down detail there. So you've probably already done it. Definitely join the Windows Insider program. I want your feedback. Go and explore the samples and check out this roaming app data resources that I just pointed to. And get your app ready for management. So there you go. This was really finishing school and business school for your application. Raise apps that respect data and that help users respect data, and you will be rewarded. I hope you see this all as your golden ticket into the enterprise. Thank you. I think we have a few minutes for questions.
Derek?
Yeah.
So,
Please come up to the microphones if you have questions.
nice job. One question. As you look at federal and health, in terms of their policy for FIPS and HIPAA protection, is this extensible to cover that policy as well, so you could have corporate-owned, business-operated, and COPE, which is corporate-owned, personally enabled devices that actually manage those, multi-persona applications of data protection? Is that clear?
The last part wasn't too clear to me.
You have multi-personas. I mean, you have different personas. You've got your work persona, you've got your professional persona, and then if you've got data rooms where there's actually protected data, and you actually want to enable a single device. I'm not referring to Hillary Clinton, obviously, but that's kind of the use mode. Mm-hmm. Do you see that being supported here?
Yeah, so we are supporting this idea of different identities. For V1, we're really looking at your work self and your personal self. And the identity that you use to sign up for MDM is what we're going to be using to separate your work and personal. If this is feedback about having multiple work personas, that's excellent feedback, and I think that we need to take that feedback and think about how we'll do it. But For a V1, there's really only one extra persona, the work persona. Thank you.
Are these APIs available through Win32?
Yes. So the question was about whether this is available for Win32. Let me clarify. These are WinRT APIs. They are. But they are callable from desktop. So they don't have the shape of a Win32 API, but they are nonetheless callable from desktop.
So we would have to create a DLL using the RT code and call them from a Win32 app?
You don't necessarily have to create a separate DLL. It's just that the calling convention will be different, and what things that you call from will be different. So instead of having the C# dot convention in between each of them,
C++,
colophons.
not C#, unmanaged code.
Sure. And yes, you can. Essentially, WinRT is COM.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you talked about the enterprise data protection and Enlightened apps. Are you going to show more details on the SDK for iOS and Android?
Sorry, I didn't
Sorry.
catch the question.
Are you going to show more details on the enterprise data protection and Enlightened apps SDK for iOS and Android?
So it's about iOS and Android. So no, I covered today the Windows aspects of it. What I'd encourage you to do is go get I think they call it the Walled Garden SDK from Microsoft Intune. And that's how you enlighten an application for iOS and Android management.
Okay, and the second question I have is, since you're enlightening apps for all platforms, are you also considering opening up the protocol coming from the MDM management server that controls those apps so that third-party MDM vendors can control enlightened apps for iOS, Android, and Windows, not just Intune, in other words?
So on the Windows side of things, we've already published the OMA-DM schema for this, and I can't say who, but we are working with partners who do MDM so that they can manage their apps on Windows, Windows Phone, etc., using our existing schema. On iOS and Android, it's a bit of a different story. For that, you have to incorporate the Intune SDK to manage them.
Okay, so the Intune SDK is something we incorporate on the app side, right?
Correct.
And on the server side, third parties don't have the ability to control, let's say, Enlightened Office, or for now.
Right.
Are you looking to expand that in the future, or you can talk about that?
I think that's probably a better question for the Intune team.
Okay.
I think that we're looking at managing iOS and Android devices with our MDM solution. And in that case, they're really competing with another MDM provider. On Windows, though, we are open on any MDM provider that wants to talk to us.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
All right.
How do legacy applications fit this picture? Can legacy apps access protected data?
So the question is whether legacy apps can access protected data. Yes, they can, if they're on the allowed list. So as I said before, we have this idea of an unenlightened but allowed application. And I called them Oompa Loompas because we really expect them to be your line of business app that never does anything with personal. So they will be able to access that data. They won't need any enlightenment for that. But if you have a Win32 application that you want to handle personal data as well and be able to keep them separate, you do need to enlighten that application.
So for apps, it's totally transparent for legacy apps. File access, it's automatically decrypted and encrypted when they access files.
Yes. So what you need to think about, if you're familiar with the encrypting file system, you don't have to act differently against those files. You either get access to it or you don't. And that's really the only pivot point. Once you've opened the file handle, all of the encryption and decryption is being handled at the file system layer. Yeah.
But as I can tell, it's not EFS-based, right?
No, it is, actually.
It is?
Yes. So what we do is we've enlightened EFS to use new keying mechanisms.
Oh.
But at the file system layer, it's really just writing and reading encrypted bytes straight off the disk.
Okay, thank you.
Very welcome.
Sorry. How does this work with Office 365?
It works great with Office 365. Next question. No.
So does it handle protected, enlightened files, whatever, up in the cloud as well?
I see. So this might actually be a conditional access question really for Janeni. She's nodding in the corner and smiling. So you could set up your network policies to require your O365 tenant to go through a proxy that is owned by you and to not connect to anything else. And then you would be governing the access to your enterprise data in O365 based off of whether they have VPN access or not. The other thing is, when you're accessing corporate data, we don't require it to be encrypted on the other end. It's really about, did it stay in the family? Is that enterprise data going to an enterprise location? Yes, no.
Okay. Thank you.
Very welcome. By the way, I am going to be sticking around in the Windows Insider Lounge for a good 60 minutes after this, maybe longer, depending on how many questions there are. Feel free to drop by if we run out of time.
I had 2 questions.
Yep.
Is this NTFS only, or does it also support FAT file systems?
You did notice that I put it on a USB stick, and it was an old USB stick. I did not reformat it.
Good point. And also, how does this work in an offline scenario? So I reboot my machine, take it home, power it back on to do some late night work.
I'm sorry, I missed the first part.
How does this work in an offline scenario?
Offline, it works fine. Yeah. So the key provisioning would have happened as part of the original MDM setup. So you can continue to work with your enterprise data and create new enterprise data even when you're offline.
Thank you.
What happens if I share the file with a colleague who's not on Windows 10, who's on Windows 7, for example, on an enterprise managed device as well? Is he able to read the file?
So it's going to depend on whether the administrators allowed roaming and sharing. Essentially, roaming and sharing is using RMS key servers to wrap the data and also to set up the policy for sharing. So if you want to be able to roam and share data with other people, you need the IT administrator to set that up. If they have, well, there are RMS readers on all of these other platforms. Certainly, you can read an RMS file on Windows 7, and you could all the way down to XP probably. And you can also read it on other devices like iOS and Android, because we have readers on those platforms as well.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, good talk.
Hi.
I just had a question. I was curious if we had an existing line of business app, written targeting a previous version of Windows, and it was installed via MDM for Windows 10. Is it implicitly going to take advantage of the data protection?
Yes, but it's not it being installed with MDM that gives it the use of this feature. It's that they also set up the policy to say that that application is allowed. Once an application is allowed, if it hasn't done those things to declare enlightenment, like set its app manifest or updated its resource script, then we're going to treat it as unenlightened, and all of the discipline will come from the outside. So everything it writes to disk will be encrypted, and it'll always get VPN.
Okay, thank you.
I have another question about EFS. You said the solution uses EFS itself.
Yes.
But as far as I know, EFS was never supported on anything but NTFS. So no REFS, no FAT, no network devices. How does it work on FAT?
It's magic.
Magic?
Yes. Well, I can't tell you.
Okay.
I'm sorry. So yes, we do actually support it on form factors that handle FAT. And we did some special stuff to make sure that that happens. Yeah.
Okay. And another question. What happens if I take my legacy application, add it to allowed list, so everything it writes to disk is now encrypted with my enterprise policy?
Yes.
But various parts of Windows, they use things like internal caches. Explorer use internal caches. Its modules use internal caches like icon cache. So if I use Explorer functions, I write to disk. When I open a window like file save, it saves icons or preview images to files. How does it work? If it's encrypted, my other applications will not be able to use this data, even it's like
You're right.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. So that is where we draw this line. If you're encrypting this data, it's not going to be usable by anything that's outside of the family. So if your other application needs to access that data, either you probably want to get them both onto the allowed list somehow, and it might be that one of those applications does need to be enlightened. It's really going to be based off of the use case. I can tell that you probably want to drill down more, so I'll be available, and we can take that up in a more interactive way.
okay, thank you.
You're very welcome. Okay, sure. I just realized I didn't give a full answer to your question about FAT. When we put them on there, we essentially use a special form of the P file. And P file is the generic protected file format for RMS. And so if you take that stick out, if roaming and sharing has not been set up, you won't be able to read those files. If roaming and sharing has been set up, and you're going to an unenlightened operating system, maybe it's down level, what you'll see on disk is actually P files. And you'll be able to unwrap them, provided you have an RMS reader and you have the credentials available to get the keys from the RMS server. So thank you for reminding me to bring that up. Okay, I think I'm out of time, and I need to let the next speaker set up. So if you have any more questions, feel free to find me in the Windows Insider Lounge. Thanks.